Thanks for tuning in to this new episode of Extreme Reloading. I'm about ready to head out to the shooting range, and let me tell you what I've been up to. If you saw the last episode, that is where we talked about and actually tested the correlation between case weight and case capacity or case volume. And what we found is that there's a poor correlation between those two parameters. And since this entire season of Extreme Reloading is dedicated to fact or fiction, or uncovering the truth behind some of that reloaders voodoo out there, I thought that we had better actually ask the question of, does it really matter if we're weight sorting our cases? Now, what we saw a long time ago, a couple seasons ago, is that sorting by head stamp is very important. You're going to get different results, especially when we're talking about precision rifles. You're going to get different results if you're shooting the same load with a, let's say, Federal brass versus Lapua brass versus Norma brass, etc. And also, in the last episode, we took a look at the weight distribution of Federal 308 brass versus Lapua 308 brass and saw some pretty big differences. So that probably is the reason, really, why we need to be sorting at least by head stamp. And we saw that same relationship with some other rounds that we were working with, or other calibers that we were working with. So over the last number of years, I've been weight sorting my Lapua brass to make it even more consistent. But the question that we asked in the last episode of Extreme Reloading is, does that even matter? Does that affect the precision and the size of my groups on target? So here is what I have been doing. I have loaded 20 rounds of 308 Winchester Lapua brass in 4 different sets. Set number 1 is that group of brass that was 179.00 grains, and I measured that with the RCBS Matchmaster, and that brass was exactly the same weight, but it still had a primer in it. So once I deprimed it and went through the entire case prep process, that brass ended up at 174.1 grains, and every one of the cases in that set that I'm going to be firing as group number 1 is 174.1 grains. Set number 2 has some variability in it between 173.7 and 174.1 grains. This differs, though, not just in its case weight, it also differs in the fact that this brass has been neck turned to try to improve the uniformity of the neck wall thickness. That is kind of a, I'm going to throw that group in and fire it today, because earlier this season of Extreme Reloading we did an episode on case neck thickness, and I promised to do another follow-up on that test just to see what happens. So that's going to be an interesting group to watch again. Group number 3, or set number 3, had a range in case weights of 173.3 to 173.4. So 4/10 of a difference in case weight. And then set number 4 is the most extreme, 172.8 all the way through 174.1. So well over a grain difference in the case weights there. Every one of these had the same neck outside diameter, I should say. Every one of the set number 1, 3, and 4 had the same case neck outside diameter. The neck turned, of course, had a smaller neck diameter, but also a more uniform neck wall thickness. I primed all of these with Federal large rifle match primers, and used the 21st Century primer seeding tool to effect a very, very nice and consistent primer seeding depth. Of course, part of my process is also that I prepare those primer pockets by uniforming those things, and those primer pockets are very, very well prepared. In fact, we had a video a number of years ago that looked at the effect of all that work on the primer pockets and premium primers, the match type primers or bench rest primers, and that really does make a difference. So good stuff there. I went ahead and charged these with my optimal charge weight for the Lapua brass of 42.9 grains of RL15, and these were all weighed exactly the same. And then finally I topped them off with 168.2 grain Sierra tipped Match King bullets, and these were from the days when I used to weight sort my bullets. And previously we took a look at that last season actually, and that doesn't make a difference either in this particular rifle. Now I'll say a couple things about that, and that is that some of the things that we're seeing where I'm not seeing an effect with this or this or this is going to be particular to my rifle. Some of the other things that we're seeing, primer pockets and so on and so forth, those are more universal types of truths, I guess. Because I did test that in a number of different rifles. What I'm doing now is I'm working with my Ruger Precision rifle, and I'm trying to test, does this work better or does that work better? And hopefully those sort of things can also lead you forward on your quest toward greater precision. Well, I am absolutely ready to head out to the shooting range, fire these 4 or 5-shot groups, and I'll see you out there. I just fired 3 sighters, kind of fouled the bore, give myself a little bit of extra practice with the trigger, did quite a bit of dry fire before I started any of this. Anyway, we have our first 5-shot group right here. Very, very uniform brass weight, exactly the same weight actually. We're going to go ahead and fire this set number 1, 200 yards, bullseye in the upper left. Okay, before I fire round number 5, let me tell you a little bit about this particular round. Every one of the rounds we just fired had a pretty much identical cartridge-based ogive CBTO. 2.063 is kind of the magic number for this rifle, and those 4 rounds ahead of it were shot with that same CBTO. Now this last one has a cartridge-based ogive of 2.070. That's 7 thousandths of an inch difference. Now I was tempted to modify that and to reseed it a little bit deeper. But what I'm going to do is, what I did is I did not do that, because what that would also do is it would further compress or reduce the size of that burn chamber as that bullet is pushed further into the case. It will take up more space. And so I did not adjust that, and I'm going to see what the effect is. So we're going to go ahead and fire round number 5. There we go. Well, let's get ready for set number 2. I can see my point of impact roughly through the scope at 200 yards here, and the rounds, most of them impacted just a bit to the left, so I just gave it 2 more clicks to the right. Going to compensate for that. I'm not going to be assessing the accuracy of these rounds, but rather the precision. So it's the size of the group and not necessarily how close it is to the actual bullseye. Now these 5 rounds, set number 2, again quite consistent in case weight. Not as consistent, though, as the previous set. But what's also interesting with these is these have a much more consistent neck wall thickness. You know, we did the video a while ago on that topic, and I promised to do a little bit more. This is it. We're going to look at the effect of a much more consistent or uniform neck wall thickness. Bullseye in the upper right. Might have pulled that one a little bit to the right as I was squeezing. Clear. Set number 3. Fairly consistent case weights, actually very similar, comparable to the set I just fired. However, the neck wall thickness is just your standard stuff, so it's going to have much more variability than the group that I just fired. Let me go ahead and fire set number 3 at the bullseye in the lower left. That one flew high. It wasn't me, though. It wasn't me. All right, this is our last set, set number 4. Here's the deal on this one. All 5 of these rounds have got fairly high variability in the case weights. In fact, they're different by a couple of grains, a little bit over 2 grains. I'm going to be firing this last group, the bullseye, in the lower right. That's good. Oh, looks like that one flew high and to the left. Now, before I fire this 5th and final round, it's kind of the same thing I talked about earlier. When I initially seated this bullet, the cartridge-based ogive length was 2.071. And what I decided to do this time was to fully seat this bullet to the 2.063 length. The concern is that I'm going to get a very different muzzle velocity. That's kind of the theory. Let's go ahead and see what happens. That felt good. Now that was interesting. You know, I really didn't know how this was going to go, how it was all going to pan out. And what we found, though, is that the best of our groups, these last 2 groups that I fired, were kind of typical of what this rifle is capable of shooting. And I've talked a lot about this rifle, this Ruger Precision Rifle. Normally, under a good day, things are going well. I'll get a 0.7 to 0.8 MOA 5-shot group. And that's what we got twice. A 0.82 group on group number 3, or set number 3. And then pretty much the same thing, very similar, 0.79 MOA group for the fourth set, or group number 4. Now, neither of those, group number 3, group number 4, neither of those used highly uniform brass, in brass case weight, that is. But I guess a person could also argue that being having variability of 0.4 grain, 1.3 grains in set 3 and set 4 respectively, that is very uniform. Okay, maybe we could argue that, but it is not as uniform as the brass that was fired in set number 1, where there was no difference in case weights down to a 100th of a grain. So spending your time on case sorting by weight, or weight sorting your brass, really is probably not going to help you out, or at least that's what we saw today. Well, what does this all tell us? Well, what it tells us is there's a couple of factors affecting our precision that will override other factors. And one we certainly cannot overlook is individual shooter. And I'm not saying that and I certainly don't think that I muffed any of my shots out there on groups 1 and 2. However, I did call one on group number 2, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. But I don't feel like I muffed any of the shots on group number 1 that had that extremely, highly consistent brass. The only note about group number 1 was in regards to cartridge-based ogive, CBTO. And we saw, after I talked about that and then I fired round number 5, we saw that flew way out there. But even if I excluded that one, the group still would not have beaten or even compared well to groups 3 and 4. Now, one of those overarching variables is cartridge-based ogive, and we did an accidental experiment with set number 1 and set number 4. And that was the last round fired in both of those groups. If you recall, both of those, when I initially seeded those bullets and those rounds had very long CBTO, 7/1000ths, or about 7/1000ths of an inch longer than all the rest. And if you've been watching our series, you know that this individual Ruger precision rifle shoots very, very well with a cartridge-based ogive of 2.063 inch when I'm using these Sierra tipped Match King bullets like I was doing today. Well, anyway, on the first group, set number 1, I did not correct that. And on the last group that I fired, the very last round, I did correct that bullet's seating depth. And what we saw is that uncorrected, that bullet really flew. It flew far to the right. But when I corrected for that, the bullet shot fine. It shot very, very well. Much better than, of course, the uncorrected version. And I really didn't see a major change or any sort of change in the muzzle velocity, which was my concern when shooting set number 1. In fact, when we look at muzzle velocities, again, sets number 3 and 4 had a very nice standard deviation of muzzle velocities, and in fact, set number 4, group number 4, gave us that very nice single-digit standard deviation of muzzle velocities. But let's talk a little bit more about set number 2. Set number 2, I said I'm going to toss in this group to kind of complete or follow up on an experiment that we were working on earlier in this season of Extreme Reloading, and that had to do with neck wall thickness. And this, again, these cases were turned. The neck walls were much more uniform than in all of these other instances. But the size of the group, 1.18, really couldn't compare to what we got here. And in fact, in the previous experiment, it also didn't stack up to the standard brass that we were shooting. I'll call it standard brass because I wasn't refining the neck wall thickness. I wasn't turning those necks. And three-shot, oh, that's a wonderful three-shot group. I love that. But, and this was the one I called. This was the one I called right here. I knew I had pulled that one immediately. But that's not my extreme spread. My extreme spread is here. That one's completely uncalled. I don't know why it did that. And I suspect it has something to do with the necks. And I'm wondering now if the process of turning those necks is imparting some changes in how that neck is expanding when being fired. Because oftentimes, if you really study that closely, you'll be able to see those concentric cuts in the brass case itself. And I'm wondering if that physical change to the case is causing some of those cases to expand erratically in comparison to some of those other cases. If I could have somehow gotten 2 more shots to fit into that other nice 3-shot group, but don't we all say that all the time? Anyway, that would have been wonderful. The other reason why neck turning may not improve the groups for this particular rifle goes back again to chamber clearance. Production rifle, production barrel, production chamber. It's made to fire any sort of factory ammo that you come up with out there, no matter how thick it is. And so normally, very commonly, those factory production chambers are cut kind of generously. And that certainly could be the cause of why I'm not seeing an improvement when I'm using neck-turned brass. In some other cases or instances, custom chambers, custom barrels, you may see a very different result where you either have to turn down the necks or you see great improvements when you do that because of how that chamber has been reamed out. I'm not absolutely certain of all of that, but that certainly does make sense when we think about it in kind of the big picture. To wrap up then, where should we be spending our time? Number 1, sort by head stamp. Number 2, spend your time on perfecting and ensuring a very consistent cartridge base to ogive. You're going to have to do some testing to determine what CBTO your rifle performs best under, but then once you've completed that, you want to spend your time. I'm going to be spending my time making sure that the rounds have a very consistent cartridge base to ogive measurement. And of course, we also want to have very consistent powder charges. Now that doesn't have to be down to 1/100th of a grain. We actually did an experiment a couple of years ago looking at that, and that did not make a big difference. What's important is, number 1, to use and work up an optimal charge weight for your rifle and the cases that you're using. Then make sure that the powder charge fits into the tolerances of that optimal charge weight. Optimal charge weight for my rifle, Lapua cases, RL15, is 42.9 grains. And in reality, because that sill was fairly strong when I was working up that OCW, I could get away with a 42.8 all the way to a 43 grain charge. I throw all of my charges to 42.9 simply because it's so simple with the RCBS Matchmaster. So I'm making sure that they're all within that. But you know, we also talked about variabilities in the powder itself, as well as some variabilities we know exist in case capacity. So working up that OCW, making sure your powder charges fit within that, you're going to be prime after that. And don't forget that pretty much everything we're doing has certain tolerances. And as long as our rounds that we're producing fall within those tolerances, we're not going to see any measurable difference on paper, on our targets. Of course, in some cases, those acceptable tolerances are pretty tight. In other cases, they're more generous. Well, I'm interested to hear your insight, your thoughts and ideas about what we just did today. And once again, thanks for watching.